Most people think the dangerous person in the room is the loud one, the aggressive one, the dominant one, the person demanding attention. But history keeps teaching the same lesson over and over again. The most dangerous human being is often the quiet observer, the one absorbing everything, the one studying behavior while pretending not to notice, the one who gives chance after chance after chance until something inside them permanently shuts off. And that is exactly why breaking an empath is one of the biggest psychological mistakes a person can make, because empaths are not weak people. They are emotionally trained people. There's a difference. Weak people collapse under pressure. Empaths survive pressure for years without anyone realizing they are suffering. That is what makes them different from almost everyone around them. You have to understand something most people never learn. Empaths do not simply hear words. They read emotional intent. They detect tension in facial expressions. They notice emotional inconsistency. They study energy shifts. They recognize fake kindness faster than most trained negotiators. While other people listen to sentences, empaths listen to emotional patterns. And once patterns repeat long enough, the empath slowly begins building an internal psychological profile of the person hurting them. Quietly, silently, accurately. That's why many people become uncomfortable around emotionally intelligent individuals, because deep down they know they are being seen clearly. Not the mask, not the performance, not the personality they use in public, the real version. And that terrifies manipulative people, because manipulators survive through confusion. Empaths destroy confusion through observation. But here is where the story becomes dangerous. Empaths are usually raised to tolerate pain. That is why they stay longer than they should. Most empathetic people learned early in life that love required endurance. So they become patient with disrespect, patient with emotional inconsistency, patient with betrayal, patient with emotional neglect. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because they keep hoping people will become who they pretended to be in the beginning. That hope becomes their greatest strength, and sometimes their greatest vulnerability, because manipulative individuals mistake patience for permission. They think, they forgave me before, they'll forgive me again, they care too much to leave. And this is where people make the fatal error. They assume the empath's kindness has no limit. But every human nervous system has a threshold. Even the softest heart eventually reaches emotional exhaustion. And when that moment arrives, the shift is terrifying. Not because the empath becomes loud, but because they become emotionally silent. That silence is not weakness. It is psychological detachment. And once emotional detachment happens, the relationship is already over internally. Most people never notice the exact moment an empath stops caring. Because externally, the empath still looks calm, still polite, still respectful, still emotionally controlled. But internally, the emotional door is closed. And once an empath closes that door emotionally, reopening it becomes almost impossible. Why? Because empaths do not disconnect impulsively. They disconnect after extensive emotional evidence. That means by the time they finally leave emotionally, they have already replayed every memory, every betrayal, every disappointment hundreds of times inside their mind. The decision was not emotional. It became psychological. And psychological decisions are the hardest to reverse. This is the part many people never recover from. Because when an empath finally detaches, they stop trying to explain themselves. That confuses manipulative people. Manipulators depend on emotional reactions to maintain control. Arguments, begging, emotional chaos, guilt. Those reactions create emotional access. But when the empath becomes calm, the manipulator suddenly loses psychological leverage. And that loss of control creates panic. Now the person who once ignored the empath suddenly becomes desperate for attention. Now they want conversations. Now they want explanations. Now they want emotional access again. But the empath has already mentally exited the relationship. You see, emotionally intelligent people rarely explode without warning. They withdraw in stages. First, they stop explaining their pain. Then they stop expecting understanding. Then they stop reacting emotionally. And finally, they stop caring whether they stay or leave. That final stage terrifies people, because nothing is more psychologically unsettling than realizing the person who once loved you deeply now feels emotionally neutral. Neutrality is colder than anger. Anger still contains emotional attachment. Detachment contains closure. And closure from an empath feels brutal because empaths usually loved harder than anyone else in the room. That's why people often underestimate the emotional consequences of hurting good-hearted individuals. They think empathy means endless tolerance. It doesn't. True empathy simply means the person gave you more chances than most humans would have. But repeated emotional pain changes the nervous system. This is psychology. When a person experiences repeated disappointment, the brain begins associating emotional closeness with emotional danger. Over time, trust erodes. Not dramatically, quietly. And once trust disappears, affection begins disappearing with it. That is why some empaths suddenly become unreachable, not because they stopped feeling, but because they finally understood feeling everything was destroying them. So they adapt, and adaptation changes people, especially people who spent years emotionally surviving difficult environments. Many empaths developed emotional intelligence through pain. They became hyperaware because they had to.
As children,
They learned to read emotional tension for survival. They learned to predict moods. They learned to sense emotional danger before conflict even started. That survival mechanism later becomes empathy. But survival mechanisms also create limits. Once an empath realizes their kindness is being exploited instead of appreciated, something inside them hardens permanently, not into cruelty, into boundaries. And boundaries feel brutal to people who benefited from the empath having none. That's why some individuals become shocked after losing an empath. They say, "You changed." Number. The empath finally stopped abandoning themselves to keep others comfortable. That's what really happened. And psychologically, that transformation is powerful. Because once empathetic people reclaim emotional control, they become extremely difficult to manipulate. They no longer chase validation. They no longer fear abandonment. They no longer over-explain their emotions. Instead, they observe, quietly. And once they see repeated patterns, they make decisions without emotional noise. This is why emotionally detached empaths often appear colder after betrayal. But what people call cold is usually emotional self-protection. A nervous system that finally got tired of bleeding for people who never appreciated the sacrifice. And here's the truth nobody talks about. The biggest consequence of breaking an empath is not what they do to you. It is what you lose access to forever. You lose someone who genuinely tried to understand you. Someone who overlooked flaws. Someone who saw potential in you during your worst moments. Someone who offered emotional safety most people spend their entire lives searching for. That kind of connection is rare. And once destroyed, it rarely returns in the same form. Because broken trust changes emotional chemistry. After enough pain, the empath stops seeing possibilities and starts seeing patterns. That changes everything. Now they notice manipulation faster. Now they leave sooner. Now they trust actions more than words. Pain educates them. And educated empaths become extremely difficult to deceive twice. So when people say, "Never break an empath," they misunderstand the real warning. The warning is not about revenge. Empaths are rarely motivated by revenge. The real warning is this: never underestimate what happens when a deeply caring person finally realizes they deserve peace more than emotional suffering. Because once that realization becomes permanent, their absence becomes permanent too. And by the time most people understand what they lost, the empath is already emotionally gone. Most people think the dangerous person in the room is the loud one, the aggressive one, the person who dominates every conversation and demands attention from everyone around them. But real psychological danger rarely arrives with noise, because the individuals who truly understand human behavior are often the quiet observers sitting silently in the background, studying emotional reactions, noticing contradictions, detecting insecurity hidden behind confidence, and collecting information without needing recognition for it. And this is exactly why emotionally intelligent people are so deeply misunderstood, because their power does not come from intimidation or physical dominance, but from observation, emotional awareness, and pattern recognition, which allows them to see things other people completely miss, and while most individuals only hear. Words during conversations. Emotionally aware people pay attention to facial tension, shifts in tone, nervous gestures, forced smiles, emotional inconsistency, and hidden motives behind behavior, meaning they are constantly analyzing the emotional atmosphere without announcing it to anyone. And over time, this creates an internal psychological map of the people around them, especially the people who repeatedly hurt, manipulate, disrespect, or emotionally drain them. Because empathetic individuals often absorb emotional energy deeply and remember emotional experiences far longer than others realize, which is why many manipulative personalities become uncomfortable around highly empathetic people, since they instinctively sense that their mask is being seen through, even if nothing is openly said. And what makes this even more dangerous is that empathetic people are usually extremely patient, meaning they tolerate emotional pain longer than most individuals would, because they naturally search for the good in others and continue giving second chances even after clear disappointment. But this patience creates a major misunderstanding, because toxic individuals start believing the empath's kindness means weakness, when in reality it simply means the empath values connection enough to keep trying despite repeated emotional wounds. Yet every nervous system has limits, and eventually even the most understanding person reaches emotional exhaustion after too many betrayals. Broken. Promises, emotional manipulations, and silent disappointments, and when that breaking point finally arrives, the transformation is shocking because the empath does not usually explode emotionally or seek revenge in dramatic ways. Instead, they become emotionally detached, calm, silent, and psychologically distant, which is far more unsettling because emotional detachment means the connection has already died internally, and by the time an empath reaches this stage, they have often spent months or even years mentally replaying conversations, analyzing patterns, questioning motives, and silently grieving the relationship before anyone notices something changed. So when they finally stop caring outwardly, the decision was never impulsive but deeply psychological. And psychological decisions are extremely difficult to reverse because once emotionally intelligent people fully recognize repeated patterns of disrespect, manipulation, or emotional neglect, they stop listening to promises and start trusting behavioral evidence instead. And that is when people suddenly realize they lost access to someone who genuinely cared for them, understood them deeply, forgave repeatedly, and loved with sincerity. But by then, the empath has already emotionally disconnected in order to protect their peace. And the most brutal consequence is not revenge, but permanent emotional absence, because once a deeply caring person finally understands that their kindness is being exploited instead of appreciated, they rarely return to the same emotional openness ever again. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that empathetic individuals forget emotional pain simply because they remain quiet about it. But silence does not mean blindness, and calm behavior does not mean emotional weakness, because emotionally intelligent people often process pain internally instead of creating external chaos. And while others react immediately through anger, emotional outbursts, or confrontation, empaths usually observe first, analyze patterns second, and emotionally withdraw long before they verbally express disappointment, which is why many people never recognize the damage they are causing until it is already too late, because the empath keeps functioning normally on the surface while internally documenting every contradiction, every broken promise, every dismissive tone, every manipulative behavior, and every moment where emotional trust was slowly destroyed. And this deep level of observation is what separates emotionally aware individuals from average emotional thinkers. Since most people focus only on what was said while empaths focus on why it was said, how it was said, what emotional intention existed behind it, and whether the behavior matches the words over long periods of time, meaning they constantly track emotional consistency without openly announcing it, and over time this creates a psychological pattern recognition system that becomes extremely accurate because repeated emotional experiences teach them how to identify manipulation, dishonesty, selfishness, and emotional instability faster than most people can, especially after surviving emotionally difficult relationships or environments earlier in life, because many empathetic people develop their emotional awareness through survival rather than comfort, learning from a young age to read tension, mood changes, emotional unpredictability, and hidden anger in order to protect themselves emotionally, which later turns into advanced emotional sensitivity as adults. But this sensitivity comes with a dangerous side because once empathetic people recognize repeated emotional disrespect, something inside them slowly begins shutting down, not suddenly but gradually, and this gradual emotional shutdown is one of the most misunderstood psychological processes in human relationships because outwardly the empath may still appear caring, patient, and emotionally available while internally, they are already losing emotional attachment piece by piece, and this is why manipulative or emotionally careless individuals become shocked when the empath finally leaves emotionally, because they believed the patience would last forever, they believed forgiveness had no limit, and they confused emotional endurance with emotional dependence. But eventually the empath reaches a moment where the nervous system becomes exhausted from carrying emotional weight alone, and at that point, survival instincts replace emotional attachment, causing the empath to stop over-explaining, stop chasing reassurance, stop fighting for connection, and stop seeking validation from the people hurting them, and this silence becomes psychologically terrifying for those who once depended on the empath's emotional reactions, because emotional reactions create access and control, while emotional detachment removes both completely, and once empathetic people emotionally detach, they often become impossible to manipulate again because they stop listening to words and start trusting repeated behavioral evidence instead, making their boundaries stronger, their emotional awareness sharper, and their absence far more permanent than most people ever expected. The most dangerous moment in any relationship involving a deeply empathetic person is not when they cry, argue, complain, or express emotional pain openly, because those reactions still mean they are emotionally invested enough to fight for the connection. And as long as someone is emotionally reacting, there is still attachment present beneath the frustration. But the real psychological shift happens when the empath becomes emotionally quiet, because silence from an emotionally exhausted person is rarely random and almost never temporary. Instead, it usually signals that something inside them has fundamentally changed after long periods of emotional disappointment, betrayal, neglect, or manipulation. And most people completely misunderstand this stage because they assume calmness means healing or acceptance, when in reality it often means emotional detachment has already begun internally. And emotional detachment is one of the strongest self-protection mechanisms the human mind can create after repeated emotional pain, especially for individuals who spent years giving understanding, patience, forgiveness, emotional labor, and loyalty to people who continuously took those qualities for granted. Because empathetic individuals naturally try to repair relationships before abandoning them, often tolerating unhealthy situations far longer than emotionally detached personalities ever would. But every human nervous system eventually reaches exhaustion when emotional investment repeatedly produces emotional damage instead of emotional safety. And once that threshold is crossed, the empath slowly stops trying to save the connection because the brain begins associating closeness with emotional danger rather than comfort, which changes the entire emotional dynamic psychologically, causing the person who once chased understanding to suddenly prioritize peace instead. And this transformation confuses people because externally the empath may still appear polite, respectful, calm, and emotionally controlled, while internally they have already accepted the emotional ending of the relationship long before physically walking away. And by this stage, the empath has usually replayed every painful interaction, countless times mentally analyzed every behavioral inconsistency, questioned every excuse, and emotionally grieved the relationship in silence without anyone noticing the internal process taking place, which is why their final decision often appears sudden to others, even though psychologically it developed over months or years. And what makes this stage especially brutal is that emotionally detached empaths no longer seek revenge, arguments, emotional validation, or dramatic closure, because they stop feeling the need to convince anyone of their pain once they fully understand the emotional reality of the situation. And this emotional neutrality becomes deeply unsettling for manipulative or emotionally careless individuals, because manipulation depends on emotional access, emotional reactions, guilt, confusion, and psychological control, all of which disappear once the empath stops emotionally participating in the unhealthy dynamic, and suddenly the same person who once begged for understanding becomes impossible to emotionally reach because their survival instincts finally became stronger than their attachment. And at that point, the greatest consequence is not anger, but permanent emotional absence. Because once empathetic people fully recognize that their kindness is repeatedly being used instead of valued, they often close emotional doors forever. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation, and people usually realize the true value of that emotional connection only after it is completely gone and impossible to rebuild in the same way again. One of the harshest psychological truths people eventually learn is that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, because some of the strongest individuals in the world are the ones who continue showing compassion even after experiencing emotional pain, betrayal, disappointment, and disrespect repeatedly, and empathetic people often represent this kind of quiet emotional strength better than anyone else. They naturally try to understand others before judging them, forgive before abandoning them, and heal situations before destroying them, which is why many emotionally careless individuals completely underestimate the emotional intelligence operating beneath the empath's calm exterior, assuming patience means dependency, and assuming emotional softness means the person lacks boundaries, when in reality empathetic individuals are often studying behavior more carefully than anyone realizes, silently, tracking emotional patterns, inconsistencies, manipulations, and repeated cycles of disrespect while continuing to give opportunities for change because they genuinely want emotional harmony instead of conflict. But eventually repeated emotional wounds begin changing the nervous system itself, because the human brain is designed to adapt to repeated experiences. And when emotional pain becomes consistent over long periods of time, the brain slowly stops associating certain people with safety, trust, or emotional comfort, and instead begins associating them with exhaustion, anxiety, disappointment, and emotional instability, which gradually transforms the empath's emotional behavior from open and nurturing into guarded and emotionally distant, not because they stopped caring naturally, but because survival instincts finally override emotional attachment after too much damage accumulates internally. And this is where many people people become shocked by the transformation because the empath who once tolerated everything suddenly becomes emotionally unavailable, harder to manipulate, less reactive, more observant, and emotionally detached in ways nobody expected. But this shift does not happen overnight because emotionally intelligent people usually fight internally for a very long time before emotionally disconnecting from someone they once deeply cared about. Replaying conversations mentally, analyzing behavior patterns, questioning motives, and hoping circumstances will improve. Before finally accepting the painful reality that emotional effort alone cannot save relationships built on imbalance, manipulation, dishonesty, or emotional neglect, and once this realization becomes permanent, the empath begins reclaiming emotional energy they previously spent trying to repair people who never truly valued the sacrifice being made for them, causing a major psychological transformation where they stop over-explaining their feelings, stop seeking validation, stop chasing emotional reassurance, and stop tolerating behaviors that once drained them emotionally. And this new emotional distance often feels brutal to the people who benefited from the empath's endless patience because they suddenly lose access to someone who genuinely listened, genuinely cared, genuinely tried to understand them even during difficult moments. And what makes the loss especially painful is that emotionally detached empaths rarely return to the same emotional openness once trust has been repeatedly broken because pain educates them to trust patterns over promises and behavior over words, making future manipulation significantly harder. And the greatest consequence is not revenge or emotional destruction, but realizing too late that the person you underestimated was actually one of the rarest emotional connections you were ever going to find. And by the time that realization finally arrives, the empath has already emotionally chosen peace over attachment and self-respect over emotional suffering.